Hello, Richard. Nice to see you again.
It's great to see you, Marius.
In the autumn of 2019, you visited Bucharest, and we had a chat then, and that was right before the pandemic started. How about that? What have you been doing since then?
Well, like everyone else, my life went into a strange vortex, Marius. And I often used to read books, novels, memoirs set around the war, and there's clearly a pre-war and a post-war, and the post-war as though people are gone to another planet, and COVID feels to me very much like that, although we're still in the midst of it, and there's so much so strange that's resulted in literature and life. In my island, we were cut off from the world. No one was allowed in. I didn't see my daughter for 3 years, and no one was allowed out. That meant we didn't have COVID for 2 years. But of course, as China shows, nothing really works against it ultimately. And at a certain point, Tasmania opened back up, and now we're like everywhere else with the plague. I think it's I'm interested in what it'll do to literature. You know, there suddenly seems to be a great return to national letters. There's a great return to themes of kindness. I think too there's a confusion about the future, which I think is normal. But I think for a long time, post the end of communism, there was a really strange utopian misconception that the world would always progress to a better place, and I think COVID shattered that globally, and so it is a much stranger, but perhaps a more realistic time we live in now.
Isn't it hugely strange that after COVID here in Europe, we are dealing with a war, something that we never thought that we will live again in these terms of another kind of a country invading another.
I've really felt for my friends in Eastern Europe, in Romania, with the war. And part of me thinks, I know there's a whole lot of political and historical reasons why Putin embarked on this dreadful war, but you do wonder if it wasn't also just one of these strange acts of COVID-induced madness, that he clearly had become a very isolated, solitary figure. And it was his strange personal reaction that he finally gave in to this imperial mania that's leading to so much horror, and is having such a cataclysmic impact. It's an extraordinary thing, and yet I'm sitting here. I'm actually in France as I speak, and I'm sort of shocked by the way many French people don't see it as the war of invasion and conquest that it is, that they also don't allow the fact of the Ukrainians having agency. They simply see it as being in these 19th century terms of a battle between two great powers, America and Russia. And in that, a whole host of other people have no significance or consequence in their mentality, in the way they view it. And that's quite shocked me, you know. It's not that they're unsympathetic or hostile, but it is that they have a perception that ultimately is, to my mind, centuries out of date and doesn't accord with the reality of what's happening. And it must be a very frightening time to be in Moldova, in Romania, in Poland. It must be shocking. What's the feeling there?
Well, the feeling of confusion, of course, of fear about the future. We don't know what's going on, what's going to happen to us, because the winter is coming. And as you might know, the whole Europe is connected with the Russian natural resources. So anyway, but let's shift to a more literary conversation, because we are talking right now about your new translation in Romanian. It's your latest book. In original, the title is The Living Sea of Waking Dreams. As you can see, the Romanian title is a little bit shortened and changed. Let's start the conversation about the title. What's with the title? It's quite poetic, and unlike your other titles.
It's look, it's taken from a 19th century poem by a peasant poet, an English peasant poet called John Clare, who sort of vanished from. He wrote very beautiful poems about the natural world around him, and he lived in that last great period of what is known in the English-speaking world as enclosure, where the rich and the powerful took the last of the common lands that were held in joint possession by a local village and a local community for them to get their firewood, to hunt animals, to graze their animals, to farm for crops and so on. And over a process of 200 or 300 years, that land was gradually fenced in and turned into private property to benefit the rich and the powerful. And John Clare lived in the last part of England where that hadn't happened, and it happened in the course of his lifetime. So he saw this extraordinary natural world, which was a world, an economic world where people derived their living, but it was also a spiritual world and an aesthetic world where people derived their meaning and purpose, where they understood themselves. And his whole identity was vested in this natural world that was being destroyed. And in fact, part of his tragedy was because he was just a peasant, he ended up labouring on some of the schemes to enclose these lands. So he actually conspired in the destruction of his own world. And he went mad in the end, and he spent the last couple of decades of life in an asylum. But his poetry is very beautiful, and there's the epigraph actually has a quote from one of his poems about this process of enclosure. And I think we're living through a second great period of enclosure. We're seeing the last part of our natural world, our actual climate, and in consequence, everything that flows from that, being taken from us simply because it helps very rich corporations and very powerful people. And in fact, I mean, when we're talking about Putin's war, it is in a sense a petrochemical war. It's a war that's being waged entirely with the profits from the world, or certainly Europe's dependence on fossil fuels. And without that, that war wouldn't be possible. I also think there's another even more insidious process of enclosure that we don't think about, and that's the enclosure of our souls that's happening with technology. And I'm not anti-technology, but I do think it's very disturbing the way we've ceded so much of our inner lives, our mental lives and our spiritual lives to a handful of global giants, which are solely interested in making money from them and allowing them to be used in the most insidious ways. So we saw the manipulation of the American election that led to Trump being elected with all the terrible consequences of that. We saw the manipulation of big data being leading to the Brexit vote with all the unfortunate consequences that's had. We know that it's destructive of people's psyches. You know that apps like Instagram, depress young people and so on. And yet we allow people, or we allow these corporations to actually possess our souls, our dreams, our nightmares, and use them against us. And I think I find that very frightening. And so the book, I guess it was it was written, it was conceived in a summer when we had unprecedented fires in Tasmania of the like we'd never seen. Half the island is rainforest, which never burns for the obvious reason, it's very wet. But that had dried out over a series of ever hotter years. And we now have this phenomenon, which you're seeing in Europe, of massive lightning storms that are much larger and longer than previously seen. And that set these rainforests alight. And then the fires crept into the areas of settlement. And the fire, traditionally, we've always had fire in Australia, but they last a couple of days or a week, and then that's effectively it. And these fires went on for days and then weeks and then months. And you couldn't escape it no matter where you were. You lived in a terracotta sort of nightmarish haze of smoke. You woke with the taste of it in your mouth. You woke with the ashes of leaves and ferns scattered over your bed. And so the day went. And I began to think these things, that the way we cede our soul to technology, this destruction which we see and yet we don't see. I was interested how people refuse to see all that's happening. And there was a third aspect that where I live, it's an odd place because it still retains a lot of animals and plants and fish, birds that are unique in the world, that died out in the rest of the world. It's like a little Noah's Ark. And suddenly in the last 10 years, all these species are vanishing. And they're vanishing for several reasons, but climate change being the primary one. And again, no one seems to notice, or if they notice, they just shrug their shoulders. But I also came to think that as each one disappeared, there was less of us as human beings, that something fundamental to us was also being lost. And I didn't, the book, that would make it sound like the book is a protest or a political book. It's none of those things. I just wanted to try and honour the beauty and the wonder that I still find. Like oddly, as the world has got to a more despairing place, I sort of think that it astonishes me how beautiful so much remains, how kind people often are. I mean, people are cruel and terrible, but it seems to me extraordinary that in spite of that, people are still kind and good. And the older I get, the more I marvel at these signs of hope. And I feel if when you look closely at the world, there is much to be hopeful for. And so the book arose out of all these things. I should say, interestingly, that there is an odd Romanian influence, because I was given several books when
Richard.
Yeah.
You already touched many issues I was about to ask you. Let's leave the Romanian part a little bit for later. Let's say this is your 8th novel. You're saying it's not a protest book, but it's very grim, very dark. It's probably your darkest book so far.
Oh, really? Oh, that's
don't you see it? Well, some describe it as a magical realist tale of ecological anguish, or as you describe it, a rising scream. It's a fable, it's an eulogy, it's an allegory, it's a medical horror story at some point. So you tackle a lot of issues the ecological disaster is just the obvious one, or one of them. The problem with the social media is another. The connections between the members of the family, it's another issue. It seems that as nature is collapsing, the relationships between people is also in ruins. So I was about to ask you if you see the social media as a way of coping with a disaster, a form of, for people, a form of ignoring the truth, the reality, some sort of, I don't know, medication against this anguish?
Well, I think so. I think it's very oddly named, isn't it? It's called social media, but it's actually asocial media. It's about avoiding being with people. And people are difficult and messy and confused and confusing. And social media allows a much more solipsistic way of dealing with people. And so when people anger you or annoy you, you cancel them. But you can't do that with your family unless you're a particular type of person. Some people do, but most of us annoy other people and are annoyed by other people, but we find ways of rubbing along, and in rubbing along, we often discover deep affections, meaning, purpose, and so on. So I think that it's part of a general retreat into an ever more individualized society that's damaging for us. I mean, Sartre famously wrote that hell is other people, but the problem is so too is heaven. And you can't have the heaven without the hell, unfortunately. And social media tries to pretend you can elude the hell by cancelling people and so on. You can't. You have to, at a certain point, go outside and deal with others. And in that, you discover who you are and what life is. So I also think it became a way, you know, became like a Gregorian chant or something. It was just something people retreated into to numb their minds as the world became ever more bewildering. They would retreat to their social media feeds and so on. And I was interested too to how some people have been very encouraged to pursue individual success, and lives now are ranked in terms of failure and success. And it seems to me to be a very damaging way to view a human existence. And you still meet people who are often dismissed, who've lived life simply being with others, doing things with others. Materially, they haven't achieved much, but ultimately their lives seem to be richer and better. And there is a wisdom about it. And so in the family, in the book, there's 3 siblings, and 2 of them have pursued very successful lives. And one of them is a failure. He stutters, he irritates the other 2. Yet ultimately there's a certain wisdom, not in what he says, but how he lives his life, which is with a certain integrity that they long for but are unable to find, because they're brought into a mantra of individual achievement being the measure of all things.
So in the center of the novel is this long agony of Francie, a 87-year-old woman, the mother of these 3 siblings, who simply, she's not allowed to die peacefully. Her agony is is sustained by the love of the siblings, by their greed, I don't know, by the desire to handle things with all costs. Is this your way to tackle the issue of the right to die? I know in New Zealand there is a law that allows you to, in a set, if you're dealing with a great illness, you can choose to die. So is this a way of you to tackle this issue?
No, I wasn't actually consciously writing about euthanasia. There has been a great debate about that in Australia, and the laws are now largely changed in Australia. But it was more the way that everyone wants to live forever and no one wants to get old. There's a contempt for being old. There's a refusal to admit what it means. And certainly in my society, Australian society, it's sort of shocking the way old people are treated. I mean, with COVID, I don't know how it went in Romania, but we had very large outbreaks in our old age people's homes. And it was tolerated to an extent which it wouldn't have been if it was children at a school. We have a different value we place on young lives as opposed to the very old. And I've been going out into traditional Aboriginal communities, and I noticed how their old people are treated with extraordinary respect. And I realised that in my lifetime, I'd seen that respect crumble in much of Western culture. And it seemed to me a very recent thing. And coupled with this was this terror of death, which I think is not a terror of death so much as a terror of never having lived. You know, that many people allow their lives to be subsumed in ideas of career or self-advancement, but they never really live. They postpone living, and then they suddenly reach a point at which they're confronted with their mortality, and it horrifies them. And what they want, they beg to be allowed some time to finally live. But of course, life doesn't allow us those sort of choices. And I wanted to write about people who, and two of the characters are like this, that for a period are able to control everything. They control their careers, they control their finances, they're not wealthy, but they're affluent, and they control their bodies. But of course, you can never control your body. Ultimately, your body is a fragile construct that collapses and perishes. That's simple biology. And so I was interested in writing about people who live with these strange vanities, and when they're tested against the reality of their mother dying, they're offended that their mother's dying, and then they do everything in their power not to really keep her alive, but to stop her dying. So she actually ends up in a form of living death. But that they would rather that than be offended by the fact that she died. So it's not, it wasn't about euthanasia as such. It was more about the more general ideas about how we view the aged, how we view dying, and so on, and how we view death. And I think, you know, you see it with these Silicon Valley people who are into cryogenically preserving themselves and shooting themselves off to Mars, and they are desperate for something, I think, in which they might find their soul. You know, at some point at the journey will make possible the discovery of their soul, but in fact they're running away from their soul always. And that the fundamental problem is that they've created conditions for a life in which they never ever dare look into their own soul and what it might tell them about themselves, which seems to me to be the real purpose of living. But I was a bit, you said it was a dark novel. I actually thought it was a comic novel too, and it may be the black Australian humour, but it was seen by many in Australia as a black lead comic novel. So it is not meant to be read as a tragedy, I should say.
Well, certainly there is a lot of death in your book. Just imagine, Terzo dies in an accident. Their brother killed himself as a teenager after being somehow abused in a Catholic church, or something, if I remember well.
Yes.
Tommy's son is schizophrenic. Anna's son is a drug and game addict. Anna's disappearing, literally disappearing.
Yeah.
How about that? The fading of a real person. This seems to be a Gogolian topic, yeah.
What a Gogolian.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
But also, Woody Allen made a movie 20 years ago, Deconstructing Harry, about a character who's actually dealing with his own disappearance. So the same thing that is happening with Anna. Of course, the metaphor is quite clear here. The world is vanishing, the people, the animals and the plants are vanishing, and also ultimately the people are vanishing. Was this your main intention, to make a very readable, very clear, very clean metaphor of the extinction?
Look, this question's been put to me a lot, and the dreadful answer I must make is that there are no metaphors in my work. I never liked metaphors. It was that it just occurred to me that if someone's body parts started vanishing and other people's body parts started vanishing, we would very quickly move to accept it as normal. I mean, of the many strange things about COVID was how quickly we accepted things we would have said we would never accept. In the early days of COVID, I watched that movie Contagion, which I think the world watched, that Hollywood movie about a COVID-like illness that swept the world, which was made about 7 or 8 years ago. And what was interesting in that they had many of the medical details right, but all the characters keep flying around the world. It was inconceivable that planes would stop flying. And yet they stopped flying and everyone accepted it. Everyone stopped traveling and everyone accepted it. We accepted these things so quickly. And it intrigued me if something really extraordinary happened, like people just started losing ears and legs and, and so on. Would we be astonished? Would we be horrified? No, we always, everything becomes banal, and we're all left. Each of us live with our own tragedies, which everyone else finds banal and they're not interested in. And so we must find a way of reconciling the largeness of our own life with the disinterest of the world. And so I simply pursued that as in the writing to a certain endpoint, but it wasn't consciously put there as a metaphor, though everyone has seen it as such ever since.
But it works that way very well.
I hope it works well. Yeah, if that's how people read it. I guess I wrote it in astonishment at what was happening, and no one seemed to really notice. I think Australia's in a very odd position at the moment, that we're at an existential moment. The islands in the South Sea are actually talking about taking climate change as a human rights issue to global bodies to try and get some action on climate change, because their islands are actually going underwater. Their nations are about to vanish. But equally in Australia, whole towns now are unlivable because of fires, because of cyclones, because of flooding. You sometimes wonder if not until fireballs the size of buses roll down the streets of European capitals will people understand where we are now. You know, not until they see a fire coming at them with the sound of a jumbo jet and coming at 90 kilometers an hour down a hill towards their village or city, and there is nothing that can stop it. Will they understand? And not until there is no water. As I said earlier, I'm speaking in southern France, and for the first time, there's a drought here, which is unprecedented. Things aren't growing, but they'll be all right this year. They'll be all right next year, but maybe in 10 years' time, they'll be where Australia is, and then they will see things very, very differently, because everything ceases to work, and still we refuse to see anything. I guess there is an aspect of the book which is a strangely a strange sort of journalism from the front line of what's actually happening. You know, when you see whole communities caught between this vast continent and they end up on a thin rind of a beach, hoping a boat will come before the fires come and take them. So it's written out of an anguish and a hope, but also a sort of joy in what remains, if that doesn't sound absurd.
Richard, when you when you did visit Romania 3 years ago, you saw something that inspired you to write a couple of pages in this novel about the Romanian architecture. When Anna, the architect, the established architect in Sydney, is coming to Bucharest for a conference, she sees something in Bucharest, and this helped you to come up with a ruin theory, as I see it. What is this about? Maybe you develop a little bit this Romanian influence in your latest novel.
Well, I was just I was stunned by all the Ceausescuan ruins, these megalomaniac buildings that were started and which can never be finished, and which litter Bucharest, and that they're already like dinosaur bones from, you know, millions of years ago. They simply make no sense, you know. And I would imagine when the people who lived through the Ceausescu era are all gone, which, you know, is only a matter of a few decades, they will be incomprehensible to those that remain. Ruin theory is actually it's sort of a terrifying idea that the Nazis had, that Speer and Hitler had this idea that you would build buildings so that and the idea was that they were built to become ruins. It sort of defies sense, but there is something in the totalitarian mind that welcomes ruin and destruction. And when you look at what Putin is doing in Ukraine at the moment, what he did in Seria, what he did in Chechnya, there is a pleasure in destruction that some people take. And another theme of the book was about how there is something about beauty that an aspect of humanity can't stand. And people, when they're presented with beauty in other people, in the natural world, they have to smash it. And I don't know where this urge comes from, but it exists in human beings, and it's a terrible urge. And it's, of course, there are political and historical reasons for destruction, but there is also something deeply disturbing in human beings at certain points where they wish to destroy what is most beautiful and what is most precious in another person, in another culture.
And you can see it at the early age when kids are very keen to destruct things and to smash toys and stuff like that from the early age. I mean, there's this need to do some destruction. Don't you see it?
I think that's true, Marius. And of all the strangenesses of the Ukrainian war, you know, now Putin has come out and said flatly that he wants to recreate the Russian Empire, but an empire of what? Of ruins. You know, his whole military strategy now is simply to completely reduce to dust each piece of land and city he occupies. So what is it an empire of? It's an empire of negativity, of non-human. And yet that is the achievement that he wishes for. There's something deeply sad. And I think in much smaller ways, I think when we find beauty in the natural world and love, we're terrified by it, because I think it reminds us of our own insignificance and the fact that it's interesting if you look at, say, cave art, Stone Age, not Stone Age, but before that, Neolithic art, and all the animals are large and the human beings are small. And we've progressed from an idea in which we're part of something much larger and mysterious. And we approach that world with a certain humility till we arrive at the age of the selfie, where there's only us. And every person has thousands of photos of themselves. I mean, why? It is a strange thing. But there is another more subtle and perhaps more interesting for your viewers and readers influence. And I was recommended and given books when I was in Romania, and one, Max Blecher, is that how you say it? Blecher?
Yes, Blecher.
Blecher, yeah. His book about being in the sanatorium. And I found that a very moving and interesting book. And the sort of dream fugue that seems to be in quite a few of the Romanian novels that were given to me, I like very much. And I can see now that influenced this book, you know, because it seemed to me to be, it's an approach I haven't come across, spanning an entire novel before. And I thought it had a real power and allowed you to do different things. And it allowed you to actually inhabit a reality more powerfully. I guess, I mean, really, a novelist, above all, that they cannot be boring, and they have to create a world that you want to be in as a reader. And that dream fugue that the Romanian writers, the several that I was given, created, seemed to me to be very successful at doing that. And it really captured my imagination.
See, you have to come again to Bucharest.
I'd love to come to Bucharest. I really, you as a writer, you know, you're fortunate to be able to visit other cultures, but often it's as someone said, it can be the art of disappointment traveling. But Romania, I found so interesting, and the people were lovely. So I would, I really did enjoy my time there, and I was moved by it. Yeah.
Dear Richard, thank you for your time. We're glad to read your latest book, The Living Sea of Waking Dreams in original, Oceanul, viselor in Romanian. Have a safe trip back home, since you're in Europe right now. And we are waiting for another book of yours. We hope you're already working on something new. And maybe, who knows, we'll see each other in flesh and bones next time.
Thank you, Marius. And I really hope I get back to say hello to you and to all the other great people I met. That'll be a lot of fun. Thank you very much. Ciao.